This is Christ and Questions. Today we're asking, was Lot a virtuous man? The answer is yes, and that tells us a lot about what's righteous in God's eyes. For those who forgot, Lot is Abraham's nephew in the book of Genesis, and in many ways parallel to the great patriarch. His father Haran died while the family was still living in Ur of the Chaldees, so he came to live with Terah, father of Abraham, and was with them as the whole family moved off to Canaan. Shortly after that, God spoke to Abraham and told him to leave his father's house for the Promised Land. Now, once Abraham made the decision in faith to leave from Terah and follow God into the wilderness, many in the camp would have been bound by honor and society to follow him, faith or not. His wife, his slaves, his animals, and at least some of the men attached to him would have come along no matter what his motives were. This is just how the ancient patriarchal society worked. Lot, however, was the son of Abraham's brother, and thus could have chosen, at least in theory, to remain with Terah. Now this is an important beginning, for in his very first action, we see that he chooses to follow the prophet of God, rather than remain among the polytheists. Next we hear the family of Abraham was greatly blessed, so much that their livestock began to exceed the carrying capacity of the land. The scriptures show us a lot of conflict between men in general, but rather less often do we see conflicts between godly men presented in a light that makes it seem that both sides are being reasonable. In this case, there is genuine resource scarcity coming directly from God's blessing. The cup has been filled to overflowing, and fortunately there exists a standard way in this society for such a blessing to be managed. The most senior man below the patriarch takes a part of the tribe and goes a separate way. Not in anger, but just a natural separation. As the current patriarch, Abraham naturally owns the best stuff, and so he balances this out by allowing Lot to select the better land, which happens to be the fertile valley upon which a pair of cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, were located. Importantly, we're not told that he went down there because of the wickedness of those cities. He didn't go down there out of a desire to separate himself from the prophet of his era or from the God of the universe, but just because it's financially sensible for him to do so. He is a leader of men, Lot is. He needs to take care of his group. And this decision to go down into Sodom is never scripturally condemned by God. There are, in this world, places that are more and less spiritually dangerous, but God has given us all the world to travel in. We can covenant with God literally anywhere. And of course, in the Great Commission, a lot of the times we ourselves are required to go to more spiritually dangerous places. As long as our heart is true, God will be with us always, as indeed God is with Lot. Then we get to Genesis chapter 14, and I won't go into the War of the Nine Kings here. Instead, we'll just look at Lot's part in the story. Some people see that Lot has joined the army of Sodom and make inappropriate assumptions because they misunderstand the ancient context and are, I'm going to say it, frankly prejudiced against the righteous nephew of Abraham. Some will say, oh, don't settle near Sodom because you will inevitably be pulled into the wickedness of the city and suffer defeat, as happened for Lot. But this brief summary isn't at all what's suggested by the actual story. Lot and Abraham are semi-nomadic pastoralists, and while such groups could subsist out in the wilderness, it was quite common for them to settle in and around cities, their flocks grazing outside, but the people holding houses and small communities within the walls. This is what Lot and Abraham's family was doing at Ur of the Chaldees. There's a good chance they did it while they were in Egypt and at other places along their travels. Yes, Lot would likely have known that Sodom was a city full of wickedness, but you know what? So too was Ur, and Egypt, and any other polytheistic city they could have stopped at. Cities are full of wickedness. I live in a city, and it's full of wickedness. Sodom was not yet under the direct and prophetically confirmed condemnation of the Lord, so Lot had no real reason to think that it was any worse than any other city in a grand spiritual sense. And we're told constantly throughout his story that Lot was a righteous man. For if it were not possible to be a good man in a wicked world, then quite a lot of scripture would be rendered pointless. We are all, in a wicked world, expected to be good men. Lot's even blessed as the father of two nations at the end of this story, despite all the wickedness around him. And even though these two nations are Israel's enemies, and even though there is a condemnation upon these two nations, to be the father of two nations is a blessing. So be like Lot. Be the good man in a dark place. Anyway, some who preach on this story, they get upset. They say, if Lot was such a good man, why would he have joined the army of Sodom? But of course, this misses the point on two counts. The first is that military service in the ancient world was not typically a voluntary matter. Living anywhere in that valley, anywhere in the economic zone of either Sodom or Gomorrah or whatever other Canaanite city-states may have been around there, Lot would have been on the hook for taxes for one of those cities. And in the days before currency, taxes were taken in kind. Each year, the king of Sodom would have taken some of Lot's flock, maybe some of his wool, maybe some of the meat and milk also, perhaps. There's an open question of when a godly man should resist his government, but we know that God approved of Lot at this point in the story, so render unto Caesar should apply here as well. But taxes were also paid in direct labor as well. Each year, the king of a region would collect men as part of a fixed labor obligation to work for a season. Sometimes these men would build canals and walls. Sometimes they'd build temples, which might actually have been something morally conflicting. And sometimes they served that labor obligation in the army as conscripts. If we've already decided that Lot is not condemned for paying taxes to Sodom, then this too, serving in the military, is paying taxes in the ancient context. But there's another aspect as well. Since the year Lot gets conscripted, the army isn't waging a war that is, just on the face of it, an unjust war. Rather, if you remember from Genesis 14, an army from outside the region is coming into the region to do tremendous violence and to pillage the city and all its inhabitants. They're coming with a vengeance to destroy the city and all its people. And Lot has joined the army in defense of his adopted homeland. Even though it is probably a coerced conscription to a certain extent, we shouldn't imagine that most of these conscripts in the ancient world were necessarily unwilling. They would have all known the penalties for being beaten in battle, and they're not a lot of fun. Remember, Sodom has its wickedness, but the nation is not yet condemned by God. Or even if God has that condemnation in his mind at this point, he hasn't publicly revealed it. And if we should say that no Christian should join the army of an ungodly nation, then there would be right few homelands that a Christian nowadays could righteously defend. So not only was Lot required to join the army that year, he probably wouldn't have been wrong to do so whether or not he was required. After all, it wasn't like the enemy was some paragon of righteousness either. But of course, God decides to hand victory, in this case, to the invading army, at least some level of victory, and Lot is taken captive. But when a righteous man is taken captive, and when that captivity is not itself serving the designs of the Lord, God will send a rescuer, a Messiah of deliverance and salvation. And in this era, that Savior is Abraham. This is, by the way, one more way that we know God considers Lot to still be righteous. After Lot is saved, we get to his main story. God finally decides that now is the time to condemn the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction. We get all the special effects we could ever want. Abraham famously pleads with God that if there are righteous people in the city, then it shouldn't be destroyed. And God agrees that it is more morally wrong for the righteous to be slain with the wicked than it is for the wicked to be spared alongside the righteous, which itself is a good moral principle repeated by Christ in his wheat and tares parable. And so, in go the two angels into the gate of Sodom, hunting for righteous people, and pretty much right away they encounter Lot, who recognizes them as angels on sight, and they all go and have dinner at his place. No one else in town seems to recognize the angels for who they are or what they are. Only Lot and Abraham, the righteous families in the story, managed to do that. God has promised to Abraham that he wouldn't destroy the city if there were 10 righteous men in it, but it turns out that there's only one righteous man with his family, notably a family that's currently all female. It's an open question whether by one righteous man God meant one righteous male human or 4 righteous human beings. How God imputes righteousness upon families based upon the actions of the head of household, and how God imputes righteousness upon kingdoms based upon the actions of the king, and then how God imputes righteousness on an individual living in a wicked family or a wicked kingdom. All those are interesting things that we're not going to look at today. Anyway, God is cleverer than Abraham, and with the intention to bring the righteous man out of the city, so that the city is only destroyed at the point when 0 righteous men live there, so that Abraham's entire concern is rendered irrelevant. Anyway, we all know this story. The people of the town come to Lot's house where they're all having dinner, and the people of the town demand to have, shall we say, non-consensual interactions with the 2 angels. And here's where Lot gets criticized, which is fair, but let's be measured here. This is where we see that Lot loves God more than he loves people. Now, of course, in the New Testament, there are the 2 great commandments, love God and love people. But of course, the people whom Lot has surrounded himself with in Sodom are, we feel, sort of hard to love kind of people. Perhaps he did once attempt to proselytize and improve the situation and just got burnt out. Or maybe he entered into the city of sin with his nose a bit high in the air, being within the city, but keeping him very far from being a part of the city. Righteous gospel principles, maybe, but though love God comes before love people, the second is still a commandment from heaven going all the way back to Deuteronomy. Though I do suppose Lot is living before Deuteronomy, so who really knows what sort of moral and legalistic context he was living in. Anyway, because Lot loves God, and believing it necessary to defend the dignity of God, he offers his very children in sacrifice to God. In an Old Testament context, we talk a lot about the wickedness of child sacrifice, but the motivation for it is not inherently an evil one. The pagans of old believed that they needed to offer things to the pagan gods in order to receive benefits, and what more precious thing could they offer up than their own child? In order to defend God from attack, Lot is willing to offer up his own children to what would likely be a pretty wretched end to their own mortal existence. And unlike most, I don't think he's doing this because he's depraved or because he doesn't love his daughters. I think he just puts God first in all things. And you know who else put God first in all things? Father Abraham, the patriarch of the covenant. God said, "Kill your son," as a test of Abraham's willingness to put God first in all things. And this is a test that his nephew Lot has already passed a few chapters prior to Abraham's own test. Lot offering his daughters is the same flavor of righteousness that Abraham showed, but he gets castigated by modern exegetes while Abraham gets lauded. The crucial difference, of course, is that God did not command Lot to take such a drastic step in his own defense, though at the same time, God has not yet explicitly prohibited child sacrifice. Further, this is not the sort of ritual sacrifice that God ends up forbidding in the Isaac story, but it's sort of more like leaping in front of a bullet to defend another person. And that sort of sacrifice God still allows. It's a bit different because we don't hear the daughter's opinion on the matter, but remember that by saving Lot from the destruction, God is judging Lot to be righteous even after this encounter. Righteous but ignorant, perhaps, but it raises the question, if you were hanging out with an angel here on earth, like Lot was, and some wicked person tried to fire a gun at the angel, would you leap in front of the bullet to defend the angel? Sitting here and thinking rationally, the angel would probably be okay. At least God would be fine, and God can defend his angel better than I can. But at the same time, we have to imagine an angel to be a terrible and beautiful thing. The sort of precious and holy personages that should engender reverential love. The sort of love that would throw you in front of a bullet, even before thinking about what sort of defenses the angel might have. You sort of trust that in making whatever attempt you can in defense of God's messengers, everything will turn out right, either in God's own defensive measures or following your glorious martyrdom. It is, as I said, a bit more complicated because we don't know what the daughters think about all of this, but it's this sort of attitude and this sort of righteousness that I see in Lot. And so they escape the city. Lot does hesitate for a bit, but so does Abraham. And hesitation is not necessarily a sin, so long as your heart ends up in the right place. Lot's wife famously looks back to Sodom and is turned into a pillar of salt. And now I'm not normally not one to make a metaphor out of a miracle, but in light of what happens next, it's interesting that she's not burned or otherwise just killed, but turned into salt, as if her fertility is being attacked as a result for her yearning for a return to the town of sexual sins. Probably a discussion for a later day. And then Lot ends up in a cave with his daughters. Again, Lot does nothing wrong, though of course it's usually wise to avoid alcohol in most situations, and here's a good example of why. Also note that there's sort of a parallel and sort of a contrast between Lot's daughters and Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Lot's daughters had been righteous women. People forget that a lot. They were engaged to be married, and yet were still virgins, a commitment to chastity which was actually not universal in those days. We know from the ancient law codes that there would sometimes be tomfoolery occurring before the wedding night. But of course it certainly was more normative back then for people to wait until marriage for that sort of thing. But in a city of specifically sexual depravity, we can perhaps consider our own age when adult activities between the time of an engagement and the wedding night are, I mean, I think it's, at this point, actually the expected course of action for all but the most stodgy of conservatives. Lot's daughters have defended their virtue up until they arrive in that cave. And just as Sarah despaired of her own fertility, even in the face of God's guarantees, these daughters despaired that they would ever meet another man, both for the sake of their own pleasure and for the sake of their own childlessness. And in fact, we only hear about their childlessness as motivating them. Ancient women weren't trained by feminism to reject children and pretty universally seemed to desire to have babies, even beyond the pleasures of the bedroom, at least from what we can tell in ancient records. And the daughters of Lot don't even have the guarantee of Sarah from God himself. They're left to choose between hope and despair, and how realistic their hopes are genuinely debatable. It may seem to them at this point that perhaps the whole world is gone and there's no other men. I mean, we know that that wasn't actually the case, of course, but whether or not they knew, that is unclear. Remember, they would have known the story of Noah's Ark. Last time was a flood. Here, every settled place I know of has been hit by a giant fireball. Who knows what they could have thought or what would have been reasonable to think. Their approach, however, is pretty clearly condemned. Rather than consulting and investigating, they just sort of make assumptions, seemingly very quickly, and then they get their father drunk and attempt to repopulate the world for a third time. As a final note, though lots of really terrible things are involved in this story and in this childbirth, Lot still raises these children, recognizing the value of these children beyond his shame and sin of having been involved in the birthing of these children, and does not decide to, say, murder these children just because they were conceived in sin. Still, Lot is more interesting than most people give him credit for. And on a broader note, the Old Testament in general is a fantastic place to mine to properly understand what it is to be a good person, which is a question that goes deeper than far too many of us have the patience to dig. As always, let me know where I've gone wrong in the comments, and thank you for listening.